Welcome to QInsight from QGate, where we talk to the people who are at the sharp end of CRM, AI, and business transformation. I'm Steve Clarke.
And I'm Alastair Jupp. Today we're joined by Kelvin Papp, CEO of Enable Great. Kelvin spent 20 years working across the IT strategy, cloud infrastructure and AI services, moving from hands-on delivery into senior technology leadership. Today, through his work at Enable Great, Kelvin advises boards and leadership teams on how to make better technology decisions, focusing on clarity, maturity, and long-term impact. That perspective makes him an ideal fit for today's conversation.
Does indeed. Kelvin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. And yeah, very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelvin. So, as you'd probably imagine, we spend a lot of time talking about AI. Of course, it's very prevalent, very topical at the moment. So we wanted to take a slightly different perspective this week. What we are seeing, though, is that almost every leadership conversation that we're having seems to start with, what are we doing about AI? What are you going to do about AI? And are focusing absolutely on that hype at the moment. So I'll ask a question to kick things off. In your experience, when organizations fixate on AI first, what are they usually not looking at? And actually, should they perhaps be focusing on matters elsewhere?
Yes is the very short answer. And I think, the answer to that is generally everything else, right? When we start talking about AI and the tech first, what we're not then doing is looking at what are the business outcomes, what's the impact? Actually, is this an investment that we need to make, or are we just following the technology for the sake of the hype, the buzz, what our competitors are doing, and all of those things that mean something, yes, on paper, but actually practically in reality, are they going to impact our business? And that's something that I'm sure you guys have seen as well. I'm seeing it a lot when I'm going into these kind of conversations with organizations for the first time. They feel compelled to do something with AI because that's the thing now. But actually, as would be the case for any other technology decision, it's not about the tech. It's about what's the impact, what's the thing that we're trying to solve, what's the problem. And that's not a unique AI problem. I think that's something that leadership teams, technology leaders have struggled with for a long time, and often, are guilty of jumping straight to, as opposed to looking at why are we doing the thing that we're doing.
Do you think most pressure is on to do AI from fear of falling behind, rather than clarity of why you're actually doing it, and what outcomes you're actually looking for?
Yeah, I do. I think there's the classic kind of, we need to be on the train. The company next door that we're trying to compete with is doing something with AI. What it is, we don't know. But we should be doing the same thing. And it's hard to ignore it because it's everywhere. Every bit of technology out there at the minute seems to be, an AI version of something that we've used for the last 10 years or AI infused. And consequently, I think if you're not talking about it, if you're not using the right language and I suppose integrating AI into your roadmap, the perception is, well, we're falling behind. But as you maybe alluded to at the kind of start of the question, it's not the be all and end all. And I think there's a risk at the minute that a lot of organizations are losing sight of the why because they're focused on the what, the technology. So I think there's lots of good lessons in there on how to develop strategy, how to run technology programs. I'm sure we'll kind of unpack some of them in the next few minutes that we've got together. But for me, absolutely, I think there's a fear angle that maybe masks the why and the true rationale that organizations should be looking at when they're considering how to integrate AI into their roadmaps, into their strategy. So yeah, I think it's a big challenge at the minute.
How do you even begin? And it's a question for both Kelvin and Ali. How do you even begin to change that mindset, that perception of what is deemed so important at the moment? Because you're right, I think it's a combination of fear of falling behind the market, but also fear of what you can or what you're missing out on, what you can perhaps bring to the business. So when you go into a conversation with a business leader and the first thing on the topic of conversation right at the top of the agenda is AI, we've got our system in place, we've gone through business process, and we want AI, that's it. How do you tackle that? Because business leaders are often quite steadfast in their their roadmaps and their perception of what needs doing. How do you even broach that conversation?
Yeah, no, I guess for me, certainly, it's never an argument or a challenge, because in some respects, they're not wrong. As we kind of touched on, AI is everywhere, and it's difficult to see any technology roadmap that doesn't feature AI in some way, shape, or form at the moment. But I think, as would be the case with any transformation project or infrastructure project or application project, you've always got to start with the why, not the what. And I, certainly in the conversations I have with organizations, that's what I try and bring to any challenge, any roadmap, any set of plans. It's that, why are we doing what we're doing? Because, AI, yes, but AI surely is there being deployed to fix a problem. And I think if it's not, and if you can't, sensitively in some cases challenge that attitude of, well, we need to be doing AI, then I think you've arguably got kind of bigger problems in how you're approaching not just technology, but how you're approaching running the business. Because it's like anything, technology is an enabler. It's there to serve, a business agenda. It's there to serve relationships. And yes, ultimately everyone wants to, to generate a return in terms of having a successful proposition that lands well and sells. But, technology for most organizations, not all, but for most organizations, isn't the thing that should be front and center. And I guess the challenge for us all as we're going into different organizations and having those conversations is almost bringing that kind of conceptual bit back to the table of, well, why? Ultimately, what is it that we're trying to solve? Because if we can't shape an outcome as we start to have those conversations and give ourselves something tangible to measure, then I think, A, you're approaching it in the wrong way, but B, actually, when you get 6, 12, 18 months down the road, as maybe we're starting to see now, you're going to find yourself questioning, why did we do that thing? Because we're maybe not seeing that return on investment that we expected to see. So I don't think it's a wrong perspective to have per se, but I think I would put it in the same category as any other transformation project. I think you've got to start by saying why, frame the problem, ask the right questions, and actually get to the nub of what's the thing that AI is going to solve for you. Alastair, I don't know if you've got a kind of different view. Your conversations maybe are slightly different to mine.
I think we're quite aligned. There was a statement I saw the other day: is when you start with the outcomes, the technology becomes an option, right? And an option, not the answer, right? And I think in most conversations that we have with clients, it's all about the technology. And actually, just recently, yesterday, I had a conversation with a client who's going for a big implementation, and I was saying to them, well, we're about to go into user acceptance with them. So this is where this is the hard part now, is your people and the systems and everything that sits around that technology. You've got to get it aligned to the technology that we put in. You've got to engage them. You've got to bring them on board with it. It's otherwise what will happen is the technologist gets blamed, right? And it's not the technology. AI tends to AI or technology or CRM gets blamed for problems it's uncovered. That's a bit like a smoke alarm getting shouted at, right? It's not the technology that's causing it. There's systems in businesses that have to work with the technology, and for me that's such a critical point in some of the projects that we do, right?
Absolutely.
It's interesting. Sorry, Steve. I was going to say it's interesting. I think a lot of the conversations I'm having at the minute focus on AI being a problem that organizations need to solve, where actually it's a capability that should be helping with a problem. And I think, the conversation that we're probably all talking about having is one of, how do we define the problem before we start shopping for tools and going down the route of doing something? It is something I talked about with a former colleague the other week. There's this kind of sense of, an activity trap that leaders can fall into, where you mistake doing something for having a strategy, where actually, instead of presenting, a bunch of roadmaps or slides filled with timelines and project plans, you need to really step back and look at what's our strategy, not what's the list of things that we should be building.
Absolutely. So bringing it back to the tool element and the technology being a facilitator, I'm speaking to a lot of customers, prospective customers, about AI, who are very, very early in that kind of adoption curve, and are at that perhaps fear stage of thinking, right, we need to be doing something, but we're not quite sure. So I always ask the question, um, what do you think AI is? And invariably, Copilot is ChatGPT, and they're both tools for making dodgy pictures with extra fingers, and finessing an email here and there. But actually challenging that perception, and actually the education piece of going, right, well, as Microsoft partners, I'm going to tell you a bit about Copilot, and there are these things called agents. And actually, we're now talking about AI as a tool that can access all of your information, which sounds a bit scary, admittedly, that can then make suggestions around absolutely anything and everything around, finessing documentation, surfacing data for analytics, or whatever that might look like. So I guess the question really is, what actually happens to a business when Copilot can access things like emails, files, and data? And actually, if things aren't quite set up right, I guess that can go quite wrong quite quickly.
It can, and Copilot, it is unique, right? It's not like your ChatGPTs or your Claudes or your Perplexity type products out of the box, because it's inherently different, and in many respects it's differentiated from those tools because of the level of access that it has. And I think that's something that particularly Microsoft focus houses are maybe slightly naive to if they're coming into Copilot blind, is that level of access and that potential risk that they're unlocking as a consequence. And it's funny, I often refer to Copilot as being more like a diagnostic tool than an AI tool. That's a mouthful. Because actually what it tends to do quite quickly is almost reflect back the problems, the challenges, the issues with any given tenant, good or bad. If your data is well structured, if you've got good governance in place, if your permissions are rock solid, then those things can all be amplified really positively. You get great responses to well articulated prompts. You get great, insightful kind of documents and summaries produced on the back of chatting with it. On the contrary, if those things aren't in place, then very quickly you can find yourself with a bit of a kind of governance type nightmare. We've probably all heard the horror stories of, Joe Blogs in HR searching for something and getting the response of a finance document with everyone's salaries in. Now those things are anecdotal, and I've not seen them myself, but
Yeah.
they're feasible. And that's a risk that I don't think you have when you're talking about the more kind of chat-based AI, LLM tools that I guess most people are used to working with in their personal lives, their consumer lives. So I think, for me, Copilot is unique, it's differentiated, it's hugely powerful, but it's also something that needs to be deployed with real care. And that is arguably true for any AI product, because you need all those things that I mentioned, good governance, good permissions, good process in place. But I think it's particularly true of Copilot, and certainly in the world that I'm working in, there's lots more Copilot arguably than lots of other things. So readiness is key, education is key, understanding what it is you're putting in is key.
Microsoft itself has acknowledged that Copilot effectiveness is directly tied to the information architecture and permissions kind of hygiene, not necessarily the prompt quality. It's quite surprising. The surprises that people hit with Copilot are rarely technical. They almost organizational. People realize decision making lives in inboxes and not in processes, for example. AI exposes that ownership was assumed and not assigned. All these types of things start to surface when you go through this journey. And we've seen it as well. I'm actually awaiting at the moment a security report on our infrastructure, to see what we're actually exposing and what and it's quite, I think it's going to be quite enlightening. Actually, I'm actually quite looking forward to the report coming through. But and my world is process, right? That's where I'm very comfortable. and Copilot doesn't necessarily break processes. It kind of just reads the ones that you swore didn't exist, right? but they are in the businesses, and they're hidden, and most boards and execs have no idea what's actually going on, in the front line, if you like.
So I guess what we're talking about, and it might be a bit of a odd way of terming it, but perhaps it's a technical debt. So, and typically when we think about technical debt, we think about old servers and keyboards that have had one too many lunches eaten over the top of them that perhaps could have been changed 5-10 years ago. But actually, we're now looking at technical debt as messy permissions or unclear ownership of roles and administrative rights, or whatever that might look like. So, and Kelvin, you touched on it briefly a moment ago, and I'd like to expand on that. How do we suggest that businesses counter that? You spoke about education. Are we, from an adoption standpoint, is it confidence gaps, people readiness, technical readiness, governance? Like how do we begin to kind of fix everything before we let Copilot loose on it?
Yeah, and it's all of those things. I think back to almost the top of the call, we're talking about the rationale behind why do AI. These are the things that when you start having those, more sort of orchestrated, coordinated, proper conversations about what it is that we're doing, you start to unpick, because it's all of those things. Users need to understand not just how to use it, but how to get the most out of it. It's not just a Google replacement, which is how probably a lot of us have been guilty of using it at various points, but it's got huge power to deliver more. And therefore, if as an organization, you want to maximize your return on your investment, you want to make sure that your users are educated and getting the most out of it. Education plays a huge part in ensuring that that's driven through, but it's way more than that. On the technical readiness side, it is things, boring things like permissions reviews, like sanitization of processes. It's things like legacy teams. You might have a dozen different project teams that have all largely been dead and buried, but there's still data in them. People have still got access to them. Those things will still get surfaced if you're interacting with Copilot in a way that maybe is a little bit more generic. So I think technical readiness, governance, education are key. I wanted to pick up on something you said in the intro there when you're talking about technical debt, because all of those things, when it comes to things like permissions, we often kind of lump into that technical debt category. But I think when you're talking about AI, the kind of debt conversation goes a long way beyond technology, and it's not just technical debt and fixing those kind of foundational, data layer, data driven things, but it's how we make conversations as leaders. It's the compound effect of all those little things that over time we said we would do or circle back to, or or fix that we don't do. And I think as leadership teams, again, a conversation I have quite a lot with organizations at the minute is, things are evolving at such a pace that you can't afford to forget those things that in the moment you think, well, actually, I'm gonna park that and circle back to it, because something like AI comes along, and actually those half a dozen projects that you deferred last year because we didn't have the budget or we didn't want to tackle them now, all of a sudden they're huge blockers to deploying a potentially very useful and valuable tool like Copilot in a way that is going to allow the organization to extract value, because we potentially can't do it because of the risk associated with that. And I don't want to fearmonger around technologies like Copilot, because I think that's the extreme alternative to what we're discussing here. But I think, it's, I guess my underlying point here is it's not just fix the permissions, understand where your data is and make sure it's all clean. I think it's the hidden decisions that led to those situations occurring that actually businesses now need to get behind, start to identify and start to build plans around. And it kind of comes back to that strategy versus project point that we touched on earlier. I think AI for a lot of organizations is highlighting the need for strategy, process at all layers, technical through to leadership, in a way that in the past we've been able to get away with avoiding. maybe I'll let Alastair jump in before I talk for the remainder of the podcast. It's something I can get quite passionate about.
You've raised an interesting point there, right? Because there's a balance here between the tech for debt and sorting things out and pace, right? From my perspective in our business, rightly or wrongly, the way we approached this was we started bringing our people on board and getting them to talk the language of AI and understand it, and it was nothing more than getting them into Copilot and getting them using it, getting them familiar with it. And now they're doing some amazing stuff with it. And we kind of got to a point now where it's actually we now need to really start looking at our security and our permissions. And, from your perspective, have we done, we've kind of gone head first into it over the last 12, 18 months, and we're building things on it and we're using it in anger across the business. And it's only now we're now looking at those permissions and the tagging of files in the right way and putting in governance and all those sorts of things. Did we do wrong there, do you think? Because we're trying to do this kind of about a practical application for SMBs at the moment, right? To steer this. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we've approached it and whether that's something we should.
Too late now, Ali. Too late now.
Well, I've lost your audio, Alastair. Is it just me?
Ali, we've lost you there just for a moment. So, Kelvin, yeah, I think Ali got his question out. How badly did we do that? Should we have held our horses?
Do you know what Ali's back.
Yeah, there we go.
I was going to say, do you know what I think? I think you're in exactly the same position as dozens, if not hundreds, of other organisations are. It's the kind of classic "you're not alone" thing, and everything. With hindsight, you'd think, well, I should have done this or I should have done that, or again, those kind of leadership decisions we made when we did our transformation to cloud. We really shouldn't have done that, and we should have fixed it at the time, and I wish we had. So there's all that kind of shoulda, woulda, coulda type stuff, but it's the case everywhere, and I think the reality for most businesses is recognizing it is 80% of the issue, because actually once you're aware of it, that can flow into your education. It can flow into expediting some of those things that maybe are more critical to safe adoption, as opposed to, just having it kind of run right through your organization. So I certainly don't think you're alone, but I also don't think there's a perfect world where you can be wholly ready. I think it brings in this whole governance conversation that we've alluded to of awareness, policy, education. I guess I'd also say, before it falls out of my head, that actually it's not necessarily just an organisational failing. If you look at the way the technology's evolved, AI's come through at such a pace that for most organisations, they're adopting it arguably before it's ready and before those controls, those protections are necessarily there. If you take something like Agent 365 that got announced at Ignite just a few months back, the first time we've got a proper governance platform for AI agents developed in Copilot. You'd argue that should have been in place 18 months ago when Copilot first came out, to make sure that organizations could deploy it safely. It wasn't, but sometimes that's the nature of technology, right? And I think to a point I made a minute ago, it's about recognizing it. I think educating on risk, getting comfortable enough and knowing that you're doing what you can, because I think any organization that says they are 100% primed and ready for AI is probably either hiding something or not aware.
Yeah.
Maybe Microsoft are the worst, who knows? But yeah, short answer, no. I think you're in the same boat as many other organizations, and that's part of the challenge of dealing with technology that is at the bleeding edge, but equally is so mainstream that people expect it now and yesterday.
We did a podcast not so long ago in season 1 about the frontier firm, right? And it is a bit Wild West, right? But you have to start doing it. You have to get it. And we intentionally started the journey, decided we were going to go through the journey and understand where we face planted, where we have problems, where we fell over, so that when we're helping our clients do that journey, we can help them with those gotchas, right? That was the whole point of us and doing this. But it's quite reassuring to hear that, your perspective on Microsoft, horse before the cart kind of thing. They've done exactly the same thing, and I think every company is doing, as you say, every company is doing the same thing. You've just got to get started on it and learn your lessons.
Yeah, I think what's maybe unique about AI, but not to kind of labour this point too much, but it's so revelatory for organisations, and it unlocks so much potential that the risks are just magnified. I think, again, back to a point we made at the top of the call, it's no different to any other project. You would typically look at, what are we doing? What are the risks? How do we mitigate them before we do anything? AI is exactly the same, but I think most businesses are playing catch up because they're almost forced to deploy it at such a pace because the expectation's there. And it's about doing it, I think, consciously in my mind, and equally doing it with a plan. I think that the biggest danger for organizations deploying AI is that kind of moving quickly without a plan, not asking the right questions, just approaching it kind of super gung-ho, and unlocking a load of risk without having any kind of awareness of how to tackle it or what those potential risks are before they get there. So it's just about having a plan and asking the right conversations and getting as comfortable as you can, because there'll always be something.
There are different types of AI. Everyone talks about AI as this massive umbrella, right? And it's just AI. Okay, but what type of AI? You've got Copilot, which I safely, not necessarily conservatively say, is relatively safe, right? It's internal. You've got control of a lot of it. When you get into kind of the AI agents and it starts having the potential to do things in your system, your risks levels go up, right? That it can delete things or whatever. And then you've got the next kind of level where you're doing things for your clients, right, with AI. And, your risk then is exponentially up, where actually, you could ruin your whole business. So I think you can kind of use that as a logical way to enter into AI. You do the Copilot stuff, you understand it, you get your people understanding it. Then you move into, it's doing stuff for you, and then you get into the client. It's actually doing things for your client. And I think that's a reasonable way to approach this. I mean, would you agree, or do you have any?
I completely agree. It's the classic kind of degrees of risk thing, isn't it? You wouldn't want, as your first foray into AI, to be sticking an AI-driven bottom to your website that's got no guardrails around it and starts recommending your competitors, as a case in point. But I think you're right. There's ways and means of adopting AI across organizations that allow you to get comfortable with the governance, the education side, the what's possible and what's not. And I think there'll be a point for many organizations where they kind of tip beyond that safe AI. We've given it to our users. They can have it assist them, have it interrogate our data into, that kind of more autonomous AI, agentic AI type scenario where you've got AI doing things on the part of your business. And they're two very different conversations when you're, kind of advising and consulting on how to deploy. And I think you necessarily need to approach those, with a very different lens in terms of how you plan and how you risk mitigate and how you test before you put it into production. The expectation, I think, for most businesses is, some form of LLM type AI, whether it's Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT or another, is kind of par for the course. But I think, that next step of, agentic AI and using it to run a business, frontier firm style is a different kettle of fish.
So,
and it raises an interesting point, actually, and going back to kind of the AI being a facilitator to achieve the why. Have you had any recent engagements where you've said to a business, no, AI is not the right thing for you? Because again, when we introed to the show earlier on, I highlighted the fact that every conversation that we're having recently is AI focused. Have you been exposed to any examples where you said, look, hang on, no, don't do AI? Is the governance been that bad that you think, actually, no, this is probably not a great shout? Get your ducks in a row, then next year. Has that been something you've come
I
across
mean,
yet?
no is a strong word, right? I think, I think saying no to any CEO that is adamant that they want to get AI deployed in their business is, you're onto hiding to nowhere. But I think, yes, in terms of prompting some maybe probing questions that start to reveal some of those risks, and it's not about, extolling fear. That's very much not my style. But I think to your point, there are scenarios, and no doubt will continue to be, where organizations just aren't ready. And there's these kind of, but particularly as AI evolves and more use cases start to be unlocked and people start publicizing what they're doing with AI, I think there'll be more and more demand and appetite for leadership teams to adopt themselves. And I think, beyond the kind of LLM chat integration type AI scenario, I think there will absolutely be, cases where it's difficult for organizations to adopt without circling back and dealing with some of those kind of underlying readiness challenges that they haven't dealt with yet. So long answer to your question, but no, not yet. I think it's, everyone has got the potential to adopt and use AI to some degree, but I think the extent is probably the bigger question, and making sure that you're slowing down just enough to make sure that you've got some, some good guardrails in place. Don't underestimate the risk, I guess, is always going to be my leading question if you're starting to stray into those areas where you're maybe not ready for full-blown adoption.
I think you're right that not yet. Absolutely, get some stuff done first, but the other part is not there. Where if you're famous for your customer service, replacing your customer service with AI is a very, very high risk thing to do, right? That's what you're known for, is almost your IP, right? And you're talking about replacing it with a still unproven to a degree technology, and that is a big risk for clients. But I don't think you should ever say no, a broad no across a whole business, because there will always be something you can use it for.
I think AI is one of those areas where it's okay to go slow, and some leaders wouldn't like to hear that, perhaps, because I think there is this perception, again back to the start of the call, of we must move now and we need to adopt or fall behind. But I think this is one of those areas where there is so much potential risk or cost or need to prove and test that actually it's okay to pause and ask the right questions and do the right thing. Certainly that's the advice that I would give to any organization that's fearful. I think there, if you're not ready, maybe let someone else be the guinea pig, because not every use case is going to be done for the first time. You don't necessarily have to be the one to do it for the first time. And make sure that if you are implementing it, to your point, that the where is appropriate and it's done in the right way. But I would say, don't be afraid to move slow.
Yeah,
indeed.
For me, marketing tells a really great story about AI, right? And that just kind of puts fuel on the fire for everyone. Oh, we need to do it, and everyone thinks everyone else is further ahead than what they really are, and that's just the marketing talking, right? But actually, for clients, when they're talking to someone, they must understand what's behind that marketing and see, actually, are these people genuinely what they're saying they are? Because everyone professes to be an AI expert or even a technology expert to a degree, but there is a varying degree of scale, right? And you need to make sure that they're at the right point in that scale for what you're looking to do, I think.
Yeah. And there's also an interesting point wrapped up in that, which is that not everything that purports to be AI is AI. I think on the marketing front, there's lots of use cases and tools out there that have got a nice flashy AI badge on them at the minute, but actually are things that you've been able to do for a number of years. So don't necessarily believe all of the hype. I think it's back to that kind of question the outcome thing. There's arguably lots of ways to achieve a similar outcome. AI may be the thing you think you need, but it may not be.
Excellent. Kelvin, that actually wraps us up quite nicely. I think we're out of time for this episode. So actually, if I could ask you to summarize, in the context of what we've been speaking about today, summarize your advice to businesses when they have an appetite for AI or achieving something. What is your advice to these businesses?
I think I can keep that fairly short and sweet. I would say start with the outcome. Don't assume AI, and ask the right questions. I think the importance of understanding the problem you're trying to solve rather than tackling it immediately with some technology is vital. So yeah, that's where I would start. And as I say, summarize probably the last half hour or so of conversation, but I'm sure we could go on for much longer.
Excellent stuff. Kelvin, Ali, over to you.
So just some closing thoughts from my perspective. I'm going to talk about technology in general rather than just AI, because the same thing applies in my mind, that technology works best when it's embedded into a system that already knows how it wants to operate. When organizations struggle, it's rarely because the technology is immature. AI may be questionable, but in that one, but it's because maybe the system around it is, a system isn't a platform. It's people with clear rules, it's defined processes, all enabled by technology rather than driven by it. So I think the real question for leaders isn't what technology should we buy next, whether that's AI, CRM, automation, whatever it is. It's what do we need to fix first so the technology actually helps that. Because organizations that get the most value from tech don't start with the tools. They start by removing friction, clarifying ownership, deciding how work should really flow. If you're an SMB founder or leader, I think just do one thing first. Write down your processes, not the ideal version, the real one, what's actually happening. See the whole truth of how work is actually flowing through your business. It is incredibly freeing for most organizations to see that on paper, the reality of it. And once the system is visible and improvement by technology is then inevitable, right? That's where I am with it.
Excellent stuff.
Look, thanks to Kelvin for joining us for this episode of QInsight, and to you for all listening. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to follow or subscribe. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and YouTube.
Excellent stuff. So, Kelvin, once again, many thanks for joining us. It's been great having you on the show. And next time we will be joined by Steve Gibson, who is the founder of Lumen Consulting. And we're going to be hearing about how he's been supporting us here at QGate and our efforts to become an AI-first consultancy. Now, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please make sure you've subscribed. There is plenty more to come. And in the meantime, to learn more about QGate and how we help our businesses grow using tools like Dynamics 365 and, you guessed it, Copilot, visit us at qgate.co.uk. We look forward to seeing you next time.